are going to bind our quilt using either single fold bias tape or double fold bias tape. I'm going to demonstrate both methods and you can choose which one you would like to use. Using double fold bias tape, first step you'll want to do is unfold one edge of the bias tape and line up the unfinished edge with the edge of your quilt. You'll want to line it up so that you stitch into the fold. So that's about a 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt, and you'll just stitch it with a regular stitch length of about 2.5 or 3. And as you approach the corner of the quilt, you're going to pause your stitching a 1/4 inch from the bottom, back tack a little bit, and then you're going to miter the corner by folding the fabric 45 degrees and then back again, which will let it round the corner. You can then begin stitching right off the edge of the quilt there. The reason that we do binding before we finish our quilt is because of the ruffles. The ruffles will get in the way of binding if we apply them first. So it's easier to bind your quilt before we apply ruffles. You're going to go ahead and continue sewing along the fold and applying the binding all the way around the quilt, mitering at each corner. Now if you're uncomfortable applying binding, you can pen everything in place. It's usually a little bit easier to do for beginners. I've done this for many years, so I'm very comfortable doing it. As you get to the edge of the binding where you began, so edge of the bias strip, you're going to fold the bias strip down. So basically, you're going to cheat. I don't like to follow convention and stitch the two ends of my bias tape together. You can if you like, but this is my cheating method for doing it. Since most of these quilts are never washed, there's no harm in having just a folded edge, and then the other end of the bias tape that you've been applying will just overlap the folded end, and you can snip it off just below the edge of the fold. So basically one end will tuck inside the folded edge of the bias tape. Once you have the end trimmed, you can complete sewing along the fold, and one side of our bias tape is in place, and that's on the front of the quilt. So it'll leave a nice clean edge on the front of your quilt. So flip your quilt over and begin to wrap the binding around to the back. Make sure that the folded end of the bias tape is securing the unfolded end of the bias tape so that it gets tucked under and hidden away. Once all that's in place, you can use a pen here if you're a little uncomfortable, or you can just finger press it down nicely while you line everything up with your sewing machine. I usually increase my stitch length when I do this wrap around to the back stitching. I'm going to sew just along the edge of the quilt, so I usually make it about a 3 or 3.5. I like to make it a little bigger, goes faster. So you're just going to sew all the way around the edges, and as you approach the corners, it will self-miter because of the mitering you did on the other side. And just continue sewing around. When you get to each corner, just turn the corner. Sometimes I like to go a little bit further and back tack in place at each corner. That's just my preference. You are welcome to not do that if you don't like to. Once you get back to where you started, just trim off your threads and your bias binding is in place. You'll have basically a frame with bias tape all the way around your quilt, and it's ready for the next step of having its ruffles applied. Let's talk about single fold bias tape. And with this method, we're also going to attach our hangers at the same time as applying our binding. Unfold one edge of the bias tape and line it up with the edge of your quilt. Go ahead and fold down the end of the bias tape and begin stitching right on that fold. And that will basically make the little cheater method a little bit faster to do. You're going to continue sewing along the fold all the way around the edge of the quilt. And again, you'll miter at the edge by folding at 45-degree angles and then back again so that you can round the corner. And you will continue to sew all the way around the quilt. And what I like about using this single fold bias tape is that I can make what is normally referred to as a facing binding or a knife edge binding. And what it does is there's no longer a frame of bias tape around my quilt on the front. That's all pulled around to the back and hidden away. So it just gives it a nice, clean, modern edge. I really like doing that for some quilts. For other quilts, I like having that little black frame or dark brown frame all the way around. Now, if you have a different method of binding that you love to use it. I just like to demonstrate other methods, especially for beginners. So once you reach the end, you're going to just trim off right past the fold, finish stitching, and we'll be ready to flip the quilt over on the back so that we can make our faced or knife edge binding. So there are many different ways that you can do this. This is just the method that I've learned to use, that uses bias tape. I don't like spending time cutting binding fabric. I like buying the pre-made stuff. So you're going to flip your quilt over, and again you want to make sure that the folded edge covers the unfolded edge. And this time you're going to pull the binding all the way around so that none of it is shown on the front. So you'll pull it a little bit tighter, and at this point, if you're uncomfortable with this technique, I suggest that you iron everything down, and so that will make a nice clean edge for you to sew, or you can also pin it in place. And you're going to go ahead and begin sewing just around the edge of where you started. I always start binding quilts at approximately the 2 o'clock position. For some reason, 2 o'clock is unseen by most people, or it's less noticed than if you bind at a corner or at the bottom of your quilt. So I'm going to show you how to put a hanger in while you do binding. And to do that, I use spiral paper clips. You can use either circle spirals or square spirals, and they're readily available in many stores. And also ribbon. Ribbon, 4 pieces, 2 per hanger, about 1 inch big. So you're going to wrap a piece of ribbon around one side of the spiral paper clip and then tuck it into the binding. And you want to go ahead and fold down the top edge, so that's being tucked into the side, and then you want to fold down the top edge so you can make sure that the spiral paper clip is in place. And once it's nestled into place, you're going to sew over the ribbon in the binding once and then back again. And you're going to pause and put in the next piece of ribbon. So basically you're going to put ribbon at 90 degrees from each other. So one into the side and one into the top of the binding, tucked into the corner on each side of the top of the quilt. Stitch over your binding. You'll round your corner, and because we pulled the binding all the way around instead of using the double fold bias tape, these corners won't self-miter. So I suggest that when you get to the edge, you go ahead and you back tack over the little flap that'll be hanging off of the binding. You don't have to do this. You could do this by hand if you like, but this is my quick method for binding and applying my hanger all at once with the faced edge. So you're going to continue sewing across the top of the quilt, and you're going to stop approximately 2 inches from the side, and you'll apply the other hanger in place. Again, you'll use 2 pieces of ribbon, one tucked into the top of the quilt and one tucked into the side of the quilt. You slide it into place, and you can fold over the side of the quilt and the binding there to make sure that everything will be in place. And sew over your binding and ribbon once, and then back tack again. Put in the other piece of ribbon into the side of the quilt this time. since we're currently sewing along the top. Fold over the edge of your binding, tuck the ribbon into the binding, and sew over to the other edge. You'll rotate your quilt 90 degrees. Again, I back tack over the flap at the top, and then I sew over the edge of my ribbon in the binding twice. I just do this to make sure that everything stays in place. And then I'm going to continue sewing all the way along, making sure to pull the binding all the way around to the back. At the corners, I'm going to make sure that I back tack a little bit over the flaps that are made because of this binding technique. And when I reach the point where I started, I'll back tack to tie a knot, and you can trim off your threads. Your quilt at this point is completely bound and your hangers are already attached. So it's a very quick way to add hangers without a lot of work. You don't have to use the spiral paper clips. You could use these plastic rings that are available in most quilt shops. And you have a faced edge on your quilt. And I used black thread when I sewed around this, so if you didn't want that black stitching to be seen, you could have used a thread color that would blend in with your quilt top. So in this case, I could have used pink. But I like seeing the single line. It's very pretty to me. And this quilt is ready for its ruffles.